This is Scooby-Doo and the Vanishing Volcano. This sold for 95 cents. And on the back it says the copyright 1981 Hanna-Barbera Productions, Inc. And I bought this in a shop, and you can see it, they wrote in there 50 cents, so I guess I bought it for 50 cents. It says story by Horace J. Elias? I don't know how to say it. It all began with summer vacation from high school coming up. All four members of Mystery Inc. decided they'd like to take a trip and look for adventure. Daphne Blake coaxed her father into financing the trip, but only after he laid down some conditions. It's all very well, he said to Daphne, to look for adventure and seek out mystery, but if I'm going to pay for a trip for the four of you and that monster of a dog, whose name I can never remember, I want you to see some of the natural wonders of this great country of ours. Where do you think we should go? Or do you want us to decide? Daphne asked. You make up your own minds about where you want to go, Mr. Blake said. I'm sure that between Fred Jones and Velma Dinkley, they'll come up with something sensible and worthwhile. But if you're smart, you'll make a fine choice. You won't get Shaggy Rogers into the discussion. He'll just complicate everything. Let me know what your plans are when you've completed them. 1 week later, the four members of Mystery Inc. plus Scooby-Doo paid Mr. Blake a visit to let him know what they decided. If it's all right with you, Daddy, Daphne began, we thought we'd like to see some of the scenery in the Southwest. We drive first to southwestern Utah and see Zion National Park, then northeast to Bryce Canyon National Park, and finally go south into Arizona to see the big one, the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. Sounds like a great trip to me, Mr. Blake said. You've made a fine choice. I took that same trip myself some years ago, and it was just great. How long do you expect to be gone? Fred spoke up. I would guess about a month. We'll probably want to spend 2 or 3 weeks in and around the Grand Canyon. Very good, said Mr. Blake. Take plenty of pictures. I'll want to see them when you return. Then Daphne, Fred, Shaggy, and Velma said their goodbyes to Mr. Blake, and Scooby-Doo made an almost talking noise that could have been so long. When Mystery Inc. left town in the Mystery Machine, they headed for the southwestern corner of Utah and Zion National Park. After 4 days of driving, they arrived at Zion. There they discovered that the park is really a canyon, but unlike a great many of the canyons in Utah and Arizona, the sightseer can travel the bottom of the canyon rather than the rim. This meant that you could look up at the sheer rock walls of the canyon towering for 1,000 feet or more overhead. The four adventure seekers spent several days at Zion, camping in the campsites at the bottom of the canyon and walking the trails. Finally, they drove out of this spectacular natural wonder and headed for Bryce Canyon, less than 100 miles away. It was at the ranger station in Bryce Canyon National Park that they overheard a conversation, which changed their whole trip from a quiet sightseeing affair into something quite different. When they entered the station looking for maps and information about the famous rock formations of Bryce, which looked very much like church spires or steeples, they noticed one of the two rangers in conversation with several visitors. We were terribly disappointed, one of the visitors was saying, because we never did get to take the Monument Valley tour. We looked out over the valley from the big lodge, but we couldn't really get to see it properly without the tour. What was the trouble? Asked the ranger. It seems the tours are taken in 9 or 10 passenger vans, replied another of the visitors, with Navajo driver guides. Something's going on in that valley that has stirred up a lot of fear among the Indians who live there, and the driver guides just won't drive there anymore. What upset them? Navajos don't scare all that easily, the ranger said. The first visitor replied, I didn't get a lot of details, but there was talk about a volcano that was spitting a lot of flame and smoke and lava and making a tremendous amount of noise, but only at night. No one could find hide nor hair of it in the daytime. Apparently, a lot of these Navajos are talking about moving out of the valley to get away from what one of them called evil spirits in the earth. I think this volcano business is at the bottom of it all. No one can find it in the daytime, but it's there every night, and it showed up in several different places. At this point, Daphne nudged Fred, Velma, and Shaggy, who followed her into a corner of the station where she wouldn't be overheard. Have you three heard enough? She asked. I'm ready to leave for wherever this Manya Valley is right now. Me too, Fred exclaimed. I don't know, said Shaggy. I'm not sure how ready I am to tackle a vanishing volcano. How about the Grand Canyon? Was Velma's sensible question. Oh, poof, explained Daphne. We can see that any time. But if we hurry, we can get to Monument Valley in time to solve the mystery for them. It took only a few minutes of discussion for the members of Mystery Inc. to decide that the strange volcano in Monument Valley promised to be a lot more exciting than even the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River, one of the great natural wonders of the entire world. Fred immediately went over to the second ranger and asked for directions to Monument Valley. It's almost due southeast of here, Fred explained as he drove the mystery machine out of the Bryce Canyon National Park. What else did he tell you? Asked Velma. Well, I found out that it's a good thing that the mystery machine has four-wheel drive, Fred replied. They won't let any vehicles into the tour area that doesn't have it. Apparently, it's easy to get bogged down in the sandy bottom, and if you don't have four-wheel drive, you could be stuck in there forever. What about that volcano? Asked Shaggy. That's got me kind of spooked. Oh, come on, Shaggy, said Daphne. You can't be scared before you even know what's really going on. I don't know about that, Velma said. Shaggy may get spooked too easily, but the volcano has me puzzled. What's that supposed to mean? Asked Daphne. If it's a real volcano, Velma said, that's one thing. All you do is stay away from it. But if it isn't a real volcano, then what is it? And another thing, if it isn't real, somebody's going to gone to a lot of trouble and expense to make it look real. So much so that the local Navajos are talking about leaving their homes in the valley. And if somebody's gone to all that trouble and expense, they must have some pretty good reasons for doing it. Well, we'll know what's going on pretty soon, Fred said. It was nearly 5:30 p.m. when the mystery machine pulled into the lodge's parking lot. While Fred was arranging for their stay, Daphne, Velma, and Shaggy with Scooby-Doo in tow began to circulate and ask some questions. 40 minutes later, their baggage was in their rooms, and Daphne and Velma came into the room that Fred, Shaggy, and Scooby-Doo were occupying. What did you find out? Asked Fred. I saw you three nosing around. I guess that you are trying to find out what's going on and if there are any new developments. There are some new developments, Daphne replied, but basically, here's the way things stand. The Navajos who live in the valley are having a meeting tonight to decide whether to go or stay. No one can come to that meeting except Navajos. That leaves us out. I got talking to a member of the Navajo police force, said Shaggy. I guess they have jurisdiction and power of arrest anywhere on the Navajo reservation, which is a pretty good sized chunk of Arizona. His name is Lieutenant Running Wolf, and he'll be at that meeting tonight. How does this sound? Asked Velma. We do nothing tonight except get a good night's sleep. Tomorrow we tried to find out from the Navajo lieutenant what happened at the meeting. After lunch, we take off into the valley and have a good look around. We'll get some food from somewhere because we'll need it for dinner tomorrow night. We're going to become conveniently lost very late tomorrow afternoon. It will be too late and too dark to get back. We'll spend the night in Monument Valley. I think it's time we saw that volcano, or whatever it is, with our own eyes, Velma said. Everyone agreed that this was a good idea except for Shaggy and Scooby-Doo, who gave a low moan and made an unsuccessful attempt to crawl under a bed. The next morning, Shaggy talked to Lieutenant Running Wolf and reported back to Daphne, Fred, and Velma. Last night at the meeting, he said, a lot of the tribe wanted to leave the valley and move southeast of here into the county around Canyon de Chelly. They're pretty well spooked over this volcano. They saw it again last night. Velma said, you say they saw the volcano last night. Didn't they try to get near it at all? Some of the younger Navajos and Lieutenant Running Wolf set out to try to track it down, but there was something new last night. Shaggy replied. Before they were able to get anywhere near it, it disappeared, and half an hour later it showed up again in another location. Are you sure you heard correctly? Asked Fred. How could a volcano suddenly disappear? I guess if we knew the answer to that, we'll have a mystery all nicely figured out and tied up neatly in a bubble. Shaggy replied. All they could tell me was that one minute it was belching fire and smoke and lava and making all sorts of awful noises, and the next minute nothing. That settles it then, exclaimed Daphne. Tonight we're going to be out there and see this wandering volcano for ourselves. That night, the mystery machine headed away from the lodge on the road that led into Monument Valley. Would you look at that landscape out there? Exclaimed Daphne. They were soon driving on a dirt road which had been scraped and packed to make it passable. In many places, however, the hard, packed earth which was mostly sand, had been softened by recent rains, and some of the turns were now difficult to negotiate. The landscape was, for the most part, flat, with an occasional gully or ravine. But out of the flat land rose monstrous rock formations in weird twisted shapes and in enormous numbers. Towering hundreds of feet in the air and sometimes a mile or more in length, the gigantic rock formations of Monument Valley towered in every direction as far as the eye could see. "Golly!" cried Shaggy. "This place is scary enough without any night-blooming volcanoes." "Do you have any idea of where we're headed?" asked Velma. "This valley's big enough to hide a dozen volcanoes and a small army besides." "I did get some idea from one of the Indian guides I talked to," Fred replied as he wrestled the mystery machine around yet another S-curve. "He told me to keep on this road until we can see a formation called the Mitten. Most of the volcanic action has been within a mile or so of that. Hang on tight," he yelled as he speeded up to climb a short rise with an abrupt right-hand turn at the top. "We're not going to get stuck, are we?" asked Shaggy. "With no tours running, we could be hung up forever." "Don't worry, Shaggy," Fred replied. "I set us up for a four-wheel drive before we left the parking lot. We've got enough pulling power to get us through anything the Monument Valley roads can throw at us." "Is that Mitten ahead? Maybe a couple of miles?" asked Daphne. "I don't think so," answered Fred. "I think it's more in the center of the valley. That one," he went on, pointing ahead, "is probably the one called Eye of the Needle. You can see why." "Fred," said Velma, "have you been noticing the wheel tracks both on and off this road?" "Sure, Velma," Fred replied. "They're tracks of vans that went through here every day before the volcano showed up." "I don't think so," Velma said. "Those tracks look like they were made by something bigger and heavier than a small van." "I don't agree," Fred said. "If there was anything that big around, someone would have seen it and said something." "Not if whoever was using it didn't want anyone to know about it," Velma retorted hotly. "As I said before, this valley's big enough to hide almost anything." I think that before we come to any conclusions about trucks or vans or almost anything," Daphne said, "we better wait until we've seen the volcano for ourselves and had a chance to snoop around a bit." This bit of common sense reasoning quieted everyone down. A little more than an hour later, Fred said, "I think that's the Mitten up ahead. See the shape? One spire is for the thumb, the rest is of the hand." "I guess we should think about hiding the mystery machine somewhere," Daphne said. "I think you're right, Daphne," Fred agreed. "I'll just get it off the road behind something, and we'll wait for dark." "It might be a good idea if we tried to catch a little sleep until dark," said Shaggy. "We could be awake most of the night." "Good idea, Shaggy," Fred exclaimed. "I think even Scooby-Doo would agree with you." At this, Scooby-Doo raised his head and, without opening his eyes, made a sort of uh-huh noise. Fred said, "I think we shouldn't all be asleep at once. We have about 3 hours until dark. I'll stand watch for the first hour and a half, and then I'll wake you, Shaggy, and you can take over, okay?" Shaggy agreed and was awakened an hour and a half later by Fred. "Keep a sharp watch, Shaggy," Fred said before turning in for his nap. "It'll be dark in a little while. If anyone's going to try anything, it'll be about then. With the setting sun at someone's back, they could be on top of you before you know it." A little over an hour later, Fred, Velma, and Daphne were awakened by a series of yells. A loud ouch from Shaggy and something that sounded like a groan from Scooby-Doo. "Shaggy, what happened?" yelled Fred as he bounded out of the mystery machine. Stretched out on the ground was Shaggy, holding his head while Scooby-Doo stood over him trying to lick Shaggy's face. Off in the distance, a running figure could be seen dimly in the twilight, disappearing around the nearest corner of the Mitten. Shaggy finally got up and said, "Stop it, Scooby-Doo. I don't need my face licked." "Never mind, Scooby," Fred exclaimed. "Tell us what happened." "I was out here standing guard," Shaggy began, "and Scooby came out to keep me company, but all he did was go to sleep again. Anyhow, a little while ago, I thought I heard a noise and went around the side of the mystery machine to check it out. Somebody was fooling around with our gas tank. I tried to grab him, but he hit me over the head with something and took off in a hurry." Daphne helped Shaggy to his feet and sat him down inside the mystery machine. At the same time, Fred went to have a look at the gas tank. He looked carefully, but saw no signs of tampering. "Maybe whoever it was wanted to siphon off a little gasoline," he remarked to Velma. "Maybe that, or maybe he wanted to drain our gas tank and strand us out here," Velma replied. Then she looked at the ground under the spot of the fender where the filler cap for the gas tank was, went down on one knee, looked again, and said, "Fred, get a flashlight and shine it down here. Don't say anything about this, though. Shaggy and Scooby are scared enough already." When Fred returned with the flashlight, Velma aimed it at the particular spot on the ground. "What's that white stuff?" asked Fred. "Wet your finger and touch it to the white stuff and taste it," Velma said. Fred picked up some of the white granules on his moistened finger and touched his finger to his tongue. "Whatever it is, it's sweet," he said. Velma replied, "Of course it's sweet, Fred. It's sugar." "Well, what the heck is sugar doing here?" asked Fred. "If Shaggy hadn't gotten there when he did," Velma replied, "that sugar would have been in our gas tank. It would have clogged up the carburetor, fuel lines and cylinders, and in general ruined the motor in about 15 minutes of running time." "Yike! Somebody really wants us to be stuck out here in the valley," Fred exclaimed. "We'll have to really mount a guard at night, now that it's pitch dark." And then there was a distant explosion of noise and the volcano appeared. Heavy smoke and flame poured from the top of the cone, and thick streams of red-hot lava coursed down its sides. Shaggy and Daphne burst out of the Mystery Machine, and all 4 members of Mystery Inc. stared at the awesome sight. Scooby-Doo, of course, tried to get under the seat and added to the noise with dismal, terrified howls. "Holy smoke," gasped Shaggy. "No wonder the Navajos want to move out of Monument Valley. I would too if I lived here." Quietly, Velma said to Fred, "Have you got any kind of line of sight on where that thing is? Could you get to it in daylight? Looks like about 3 or 4 miles away." "I think so," Fred replied. "I can pretty well remember what's in that general direction at any rate. Daphne, how about you? Could you find a straight line to that thing in the morning?" There was no answer from Daphne. Fred let out a loose yell, "Daphne, Daph!" But again there was no answer. "Shaggy, you were standing right there with her. What happened?" "I didn't see anything," replied Shaggy. "I thought she was still here." "You don't suppose the same people who tried to put sugar in our gas tank grabbed her, do you?" Fred asked. Velma, who was usually the most level-headed of the 4, said, "I guess it's possible, but I don't think anyone would try anything with all of us together this way. You know Daphne. She likes to go off on her own to find out things. She'll probably be back in a little while as soon as she satisfies her curiosity." "Well," replied Fred, "that explanation doesn't satisfy me. We can't have her wandering around in the night with some people around who have tried to put us out of action already. Her father would never forgive any of us if anything went wrong." "Well, what do you suggest?" asked Velma. "We can't just charge around in the pitch dark looking for her." "Scooby-Doo! Scooby-Doo! Where are you?" cried Fred. Scooby from inside the Mystery Machine made a noise which sounded almost exactly like, "Who, me? You can't mean me." "You bet your dog biscuits I mean you," yelled Fred. "Come out here now." Slowly, Scooby-Doo got out of the Mystery Machine. He looked up at Fred mournfully as if to say, "If you're depending on me, forget it." "Scooby-Doo, find Daphne and find her fast," Fred ordered. "This is your one big chance to be a hero." At the word hero, Scooby got to his feet, looked around at the 3 remaining members of Mystery Inc., put on his best "Here comes the hero dog to the rescue" expression, and immediately began to sniff in a circle. Suddenly, he let loose one excited yelp and charged off into the darkness. "Do you think he'll find Daphne?" asked Shaggy. "I don't know, but it's worth a try," replied Fred. Then he turned to Velma. "There's something about that volcano that's bugging me, but I can't put my finger on it. Outside of the fact that my brain tells me there can't possibly be a volcano there, and if there is a volcano there, it can't possibly disappear in the daylight." By the first light in the morning, there was no sign of Daphne. Shortly after dawn, Scooby-Doo returned looking bedraggled and exhausted. Velma spotted it first. "Fred, Shaggy, look here. That's Daphne's scarf tied around his collar." Fred crossed swiftly to where Scooby-Doo was stretched out wearily near the Mystery Machine. He reached down for the scarf, pulled it at it, and exclaimed, "Hey, there's a note attached." "Read it," cried Shaggy and Velma together. Fred unfolded the grimy piece of paper and read, "We have the girl. We'll keep her unharmed as long as we're satisfied you're not interfering in our business. As a starter, get out of Monument Valley now and don't come back unless you never want to see her again." Shaggy began to wring his hands. "What can we do?" he wailed. "I'll tell you one thing we can't do," snapped Velma. "That's push a panic button. Now, Shaggy, cut that out. We're going to need all the thinking we've got, and you're no good to us the way you're carrying on." "Right," cried Fred. "I'll tell you what I think. We're kind of stumped out here. I suggest we go back to the lodge. I've got some thinking to do, and a few things I may want to work on. If that's okay with you two, let's get rolling out of here. Good idea, agreed Velma. That'll help convince whoever those people are who have Daphne that we're taking them seriously. As soon as they arrive back at the lodge, Fred said, "You two circulate, and for Pete's sake, look worried. Somebody at that lodge is keeping tabs on us and reporting back to whoever is behind all this. I want them to think we're scared to death. In the meantime, I have to run into town for a few things. Meet you back here in a couple of hours." 2 hours later, Fred, Velma, and Shaggy met in the room Velma and Daphne had been occupying. "Anything new to report?" asked Fred. Shaggy replied, "The people who run this place were a little concerned because nearly a week ago a party of 8 pulled in here in a good-sized truck trailer. They drove into the valley next day, and nobody's seen them since." "Looks like I was wrong," Velma admitted Fred. "That must have been what made those heavy tracks you spotted." "I heard something else that's very interesting," Velma said. "There has been, for a few years now, talk there might be uranium in the valley." "How about that?" exclaimed Fred. "I got some of that same story in town." "I don't care if there's uranium or goose grease in the valley," exclaimed Shaggy. "What about Daphne? What about that dang blasted volcano? What are we doing about that?" "All in good time, Shaggy," said Fred soothingly. "I have a feeling we're going to get some answers tonight." Now I'm going back to the other room and get to work with some of the things I bought this morning. "Such as what?" asked Velma. "Oh, a half-mile or so of string, some strips of wood, half a dozen parchment lampshades, and a few electronic odds and ends. I'll show it all to you later when I'm finished." Fred replied with a sly smile. "Oh, just hope very hard that there's a good breeze blowing in the valley tonight." Late that afternoon, Shaggy and Velma met Fred in the boys' room. "Well, right off, I know what it is," Shaggy exclaimed, pointing out to an object on Fred's bed. "But what the heck do you expect to do with the kite out there in Monument Valley tonight?" "And what's this other whatcha-majig?" "With the kite, if we get any breeze, I expect to prove something I suspected last night," Fred said. "And this whatcha-majig, which I put together out of the parchment from the lampshades, the microphone from the Mystery Machine CB rig, and some of the electronic parts I mentioned, is a rather powerful parabolic microphone. The big parchment cone funnels sound to the microphone at the narrow end. By turning the cone and listening on the headphones I've wired it, we can pinpoint the source of any sounds picked up by the microphone. It will be powered by the Mystery Machine's battery." "This is all very clever," Velma said, "but how about Daphne? How do we get her away from whoever it is that abducted her?" "One step at a time, Velma," Fred replied, "and I'm expecting these two gadgets to provide the first steps in accomplishing the solution to this whole mystery, besides getting Daphne back safe and sound." "What's our next move?" asked Shaggy. "I'm getting spooked again. This afternoon there seem to be a lot more Indians around here than there were yesterday." "Our next move is to have dinner," Fred said, "and as soon as it's dark, we put the kite, the string, and the parabolic mic on board the Mystery Machine and drive out into the valley." "But everyone will see us," protested Shaggy. "You can't drive on that road without headlights." "Right," agreed Fred. "I want them to see us. Now let's have some dinner." 30 minutes after dark, the Mystery Machine headed out on the paved road. A few minutes later, the 3 members of Mystery Inc. began to drive along the dirt road, still soft in a great many places. After about an hour, Fred pulled the Mystery Machine to a halt. "If we're where I think we are," he said, "we're pretty close to where that volcano showed up last night. First off, let's see if we can get this kite up. Shaggy, climb to the top of the Mystery Machine. Then hold the kite as high in the air as you can reach. I'll start to run with the string as soon as you're ready." "All ready," called Shaggy a few moments later. "Let's go," cried Fred as he began to run. From their respective vantage points, Velma and Shaggy could see the kite mount in the air as it picked up a steady breeze blowing through the valley. It seemed to glow in the dark as it rose. "Hey, Fred!" exclaimed Shaggy. "How come I can see the kite in the dark?" As Fred continued to let out the string and the kite rose swiftly, he called, "I used a little phosphorescent dye on the wood frame." "How high are you going to take it?" "That depends on how close we are to the volcano when it starts up," Fred replied. And as if in answer to his statement, at that moment, with a huge roar, the volcano appeared. Velma took over handling the kite as Shaggy and Fred wrestled the large and cumbersome microphone out of the back of the Mystery Machine. In a few more minutes, it was set up and ready. Fred put on the headphones as he and Shaggy began to slowly turn the microphone. Suddenly, Velma shouted, "Fred, what's that on the side of the volcano? Is it a plane flying low?" "No, Velma," Fred cried. "It's what I hoped would show up. That's the shadow of our kite. What the? I don't get it, exclaimed Shaggy. Simple, yelled Fred. The volcano is nothing but a picture film projected against the sheer rock face of one of the formations here in the valley. Our kite's in the beam from the projector, and it's throwing a shadow. Then he added, keep turning the microphone. I'm getting something. Now, hold it right there. Swiftly, Fred pulled out a compass and a flashlight. It's due east, and that would put it just behind the mitten. Let's get the mic back on the board in a hurry. It's showdown time. Come on, Velma. Let the kite go. It's done its job. Velma scrambled hastily into the mystery machine, and with full headlights blazing, they took off down the dirt road, banging and bouncing as Fred roared around the curves. After about 10 minutes of this, Fred suddenly slowed the mystery machine to a safe speed and continued to approach more cautiously. And then, with no warning at all, there were half a dozen armed men surrounding the van. Come on, out of there, roared the biggest and toughest looking of the six. He seemed to be in charge. You three are in for big trouble. We warned you what we'd do if you kept poking your noses in our business. Hey, Fred, what are we going to do? Wailed Shaggy. They've got us. Watch this. Fred whispered, then put the microphone near his face and said, Running Wolf, it's time, now. For a second or two, there was no noise at all. And then the sound of automobile motors was heard, and headlights came on, lighting the whole scene. Into now brightly lit area stepped Lieutenant Running Wolf of the Navajo Police, and from four sides came what looked like a small army of Navajo braves in full Indian war feathers and paint. Oh, brother, groaned the leader, outwitted by a couple of kids and a handful of Indians. Not quite, replied the Navajo police lieutenant. This is not exactly a war party. They're all my men, Navajo police, with full powers to arrest your whole party. So why are you dressed for a Halloween party? Sneered the leader. To remind you something important, snapped Running Wolf. We're full-blooded Navajo Indians, and we have respect for your modern methods. We also have respect for our tribal history and traditions, and we expect the same from you. Take them in, he ordered. Daphne ran to join the gang. Later, Mystery Inc. was gathered in the lobby of the lodge. Okay, Fred, let's have it, Velma said. What tipped you off? Remember when I said something was bugging me about that volcano, Fred replied. This morning I remembered what it was. We were watching the volcano in action then, and it was at night. But there was sunlight on the slope of the volcano. And it just occurred to me that it could only be possible if we were looking at a picture of a volcano, a picture taken in daylight. I decided the only way to prove it without sticking my neck out too far was the kite trick. Get the kite into the beam of the projector. What was this whole thing about? Asked Daphne. Why all the mystery? What were they trying to do? I didn't learn a thing. They just locked me in a truck, gave me a little food and water, and that was it. Well, those gangsters Running Wolf picked up are talking their heads off, Fred continued. It seems there's a group of investors in the East, a pretty unscrupulous bunch, apparently. They've gotten it into their heads that there's a lot of uranium to be found in Monument Valley, but they figured that with Navajos living there, they didn't have a prayer of getting any of it. So they cooked up this volcano stunt, hoping to scare the Navajos badly enough to make them run right out of the valley. One more thing, Velma said. What made you so sure Running Wolf would show up with his men? You took one heck of a chance, it seems to me. Not really, Fred replied. First of all, I could see that he was curious about us and what we were doing. So I left him a note saying, if you want to turn off the volcano, follow that big dog tonight. And then, of course, when I located the truck and projector with the parabolic mic, I had already picked up the sound of half a dozen cars trailing us. So all I had to do was plug the mic back into the CB circuit, and I knew Running Wolf would pick up my holler for help. Well, it turned out all right, I guess. But you sure scared the pants off of me, Shaggy said. Shaggy, you scare too easily, Fred laughed. I'll bet even Scooby-Doo was scared, even a little bit. How about it, boy? Scooby-Doo raised his head from where he was dozing by the fire and made a noise that sounded suspiciously like, You'll never get it out of me. Then he lowered his head again and went back to sleep. And thank you for listening and watching. There is one last thing I forgot to mention when I was showing the book. So it says Watson right here. So whatever kid had this book originally must have been his name.